Hi, EP Euro. Welcome back. Today we're going to have our last lecture before spring break. Um, and we're going to cover the last few years of the Cold War and the decline and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So technically, this is a lot of the stuff that's in chapter 30, but I didn't want us to go off to spring break, and I didn't want us to after this, we're going to start studying for the AP exam. I didn't want to leave the Cold War in the middle. So I really did want to be able to kind of like tell the end of the story, so you can see how all of this shakes out. Um, so I'm going to cover the last couple years of the Soviet Union, what was going on in the Soviet Union in this time period. Then we're going to talk about the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the newest or the last leader of the Soviet Union, the things that he did that changed the situation, and then finally the breakaway of the Eastern Bloc countries and the final dissolution of the Soviet Union. So here is the lecture outline for you to copy down, so that you have a structure for your notes, but let's jump right in here. So we've talked before about the pretty poor living conditions in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union. By the 70s and the 80s, the Soviet Union was really struggling economically and in terms of like day-to-day living standards. It was a really sort of tough life. In addition to the fact that there were very few like political freedoms, there's a ton of like repression and oppression in the Eastern Bloc countries and in the Soviet Union. On a day-to-day basis, life was just getting very difficult to live. There were a ton of sort of economic shortcomings that led to issues like shortages of food. People in the Eastern Bloc countries and in the Soviet Union very often had to wait in lines like that, this one shown in the photograph, like on a daily or a weekly basis just to get, their groceries. And so it was sort of starting to take its toll on the average civilians. Um, in many places in the Soviet Union, people didn't have all of the goods like that they needed to live their lives. One of my students last year told me that his parents grew up in the Soviet Union, and there's sort of like a joke that if in the Soviet Union, that if you see a line forming on the street, you just get in it. Like it doesn't matter what it's for, you don't know what it's for, you just get in the line because everything was in such short supply that you basically assumed that whatever people were waiting in line for was something that you probably needed as well. So you would just get in the line, sort of no questions asked, and wait for however long it was until you got, whatever it was that they were giving out, whether it was food, whether it was more, oil for your or gas for your car, that type of thing. It was just like, well, this is how life works. And so that was a pretty clear indication for the people living in the Soviet Union and living in the Eastern Bloc that like life wasn't that good on top of all the political repression that they were facing. Their day-to-day life was becoming difficult. Another thing that's happening in the 1980s, it's a clear indication that things are going pretty poorly in the Soviet Union, was the Chernobyl disaster. In 1986, in part of the Soviet Union, there was a nuclear power plant, and there was a huge explosion that ended up killing people and, of course, releasing tons of nuclear like waste into the atmosphere, into the environment, which also had terribly negative health impacts. And Chernobyl is typically categorized as the worst nuclear disasters like ever. So the fact that it happened like on the Soviets' watch is not a good sign for them. But the thing that made it worse was that they were really trying to cover it up a lot. They were really trying to sort of mitigate how bad it was, telling people, oh no, we have it under control, this and that, because they didn't want it to be so obvious that they were struggling. But in trying to cover it up and in trying to sort of limit how bad people's perception of it was, they didn't like address it as quickly or as well as they should have. So it was clear that life in the Soviet Union in a number of ways was starting to disintegrate. This link will take you to it's like a number of photos about life in the last days of the Soviet Union, so you can sort of visually see some of the hardships that people were facing in the late 80s and early 90s. The other thing to know about the Soviet Union in the sort of 70s, the 80s, and the 90s is that their economy was really struggling. This graph down here is looking at per capita GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. It's basically how much money's worth of stuff your country is producing. And then per capita means like divided by how many people are in that country. You can see here that even in 1945, there was a pretty significant gap in GDP between the Soviet Union, they're the bottom line on this graph, and the United States. And the distance, the distance of the gap is sort of, it's pretty consistent throughout the 1960s. But once you get to the 1970s, the gap really starts to widen, and it just gets sort of wider and wider and wider. So as the United States GDP was increasing, the Soviet Union's was significantly, it was stagnating. It wasn't growing at the same rate that the US's was, and eventually it actually starts to drop off. So economically, the Soviet Union was really struggling. Part of the reason for that was the nuclear weapons buildup. We talked about this in the last lecture, that the arms race is a big component of the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union are trying to build up their storehouse of nuclear weapons. We also talked in the last lecture about Kennedy's nuclear test ban treaty, which did not work out, and the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, numbers 1 and 2. The fact that there was communication between the US and the Soviet Union to try and kind of limit the amount of nuclear weapons that existed in the world, because they recognized the potential danger of having that many weapons, as evidenced by, the Cuban Missile Crisis and our, brush with death there. We looked at this graph in the last time when I talked about SALT, because I was talking about, we could see that it wasn't necessarily that effective. In the 70s, when SALT 1 was being discussed under President Richard Nixon and then his successor, Gerald Ford, the United States does take a slight sort of dip when we're looking at how many nuclear weapons they've stockpiled. And over time, the United States does sort of decline. But throughout the period of the Cold War, especially the second half of the Cold War, the Soviet Union does not decrease the amount of nuclear weapons they're making. In fact, they dramatically increase the number of nuclear weapons that they have stockpiled. So what this means and how it's connected to the economy is because during especially the 70s and the 80s, the Soviet Union was really interested in building up their nuclear stockpile and building up their military strength, but this costs a lot of money. And so the Soviet Union was spending an incredible amount. They were overspending on their military and on nuclear development. And the thing about that is when you invest all that money into nuclear development, you don't get any money back, right? When you invest money into an industry like coal or like iron, the idea is that you are going to be, mining a lot of coal, and therefore you're going to export it and you're going to sell it, and the money will come back to your country. With nuclear weapon development, that's not really how it works, especially in the context of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is not spending all this money to develop weapons to sell. They're developing the weapons to keep for themselves, to protect themselves in the instance of a nuclear war. So they're spending tons of money on nuclear and military development and not really gaining any financial benefit. So the economy really starts to tank because of that. If you look at this graph, it compares the economic growth of the Soviet Union, which is in red, to other countries and other regions. Green is Japan, light green is Western Europe. There's the United States, obviously, in the darkest blue, and the Soviet Union is they're the bottom line on the graph. Their economy was not developing. As a result of all this, we start to see a decline in life expectancy in the Soviet Union, which is evidenced here in this graph. The death rate throughout the 70s and the 80s started to rise, meaning people weren't living as long as they used to be. And that's due to the fact that in the Soviet Union, they could not get adequate medical care. They were not getting access to all of the food that they needed. So they were malnourished, which makes them more susceptible to becoming ill. And on top of that, you had a declining birth rate as well, for a lot of the same reasons, that there wasn't good healthcare within the Soviet Union, in addition to the fact that in the Soviet Union, women were sort of expected to work. In contrast to the Western values of a woman should be a mom and stay in the house. That was not the same perception in the Soviet Union. The idea was that everyone's equal and everyone should work. And so both of those things, the health factor as well as the need for people to work, contributed to a decline in the birth rate. So what you see with an increasing death rate and a declining birth rate is that your population starts to shrink. And that's typically a bad sign. And so all of this, when we put all of this together, what we can see is that life in the Soviet Union was really taking a turn for the worse in the 70s and in the 80s. Now, in terms of economy, to be totally fair, in the 70s, the United States also was struggling economically. It's what we call like the stagnant 70s. Basically, there is a period where the US economy is also stagnating, meaning it's not growing significantly. And in the United States, actually, as well, we saw significant inflation, so the rise of prices. So yeah, to be fair, it's not like the Soviet Union was the only one suffering in the 1970s. So was the United States, but the Soviet Union was not able to rebound from that type of economic, difficulty because of their spending and because of the way their economy was set up. So in 1982, Leonid Brezhnev dies, and his successor ends up being this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev. And he was a lot younger than Brezhnev was, and he was someone who's, stepping into power in the early 80s when things are not going well in the Soviet Union. And his approach to this is to sort of revitalize the Soviet Union, revitalize them economically and politically in order to kind of get the whole country going again. Gorbachev had two policies, and he had more than two, but he had two that were really impactful in the long run. Those two policies are glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness. Basically, Gorbachev lifted a lot of the intense censorship that had been placed on the citizens and on the political system in the Soviet Union for a long time. Gorbachev, basically, takes back a lot of the intense repression that Brezhnev had put in. And so glasnost allowed, for instance, the media to lightly criticize the Communist Party or the economy or things like that. Because Gorbachev thought that if you could kind of allow people to speak their minds a little bit more, you could identify the weaknesses within the country or within the Soviet Union and then move towards fixing them and bring in, new ideas for solutions. So this allowed, like I said, media to lightly criticize the political leadership. It also allowed books to be read and published in the Soviet Union that hadn't been allowed for a long time because they either criticized the Soviet Union or because they were critical of communism. And it allowed some level of liberalization. The other big reform that he puts into place is called perestroika, which means restructuring. So this allowed for a restructuring of the economy. So it allowed for some privatization of some industries, and it allowed for a restructuring of the political system. So allowing more sort of access into the political system. So making it less elite, making the Communist Party less elite and allowing more people sort of access to it. Glasnost and perestroika allowed there for the first time in the Soviet Union to be debates, political debates, where people would talk about, what's the best way to move forward. This is very different from how Brezhnev had been running the Soviet Union, where it was sort of a top-down approach, where he made, him and his elite circle of advisors made all the choices that were sort of forced upon the people. These reforms allow for a little bit more new ideas from new people. However, as you might predict, this also kind of opens the door for change, maybe not the change that Gorbachev was expecting, much like de-Stalinization under Khrushchev's rule, which led to the Hungarian uprising, for instance. Glasnost and perestroika are also going to lead to some sort of various types of sort of revolution and rebellion within the Eastern Bloc and within the Soviet Union that will eventually lead to the demise of the Soviet Union. We've got two political cartoons to look at here. Here we have Gorbachev, who's holding one of his babies, glasnost, or openness. And you can see that Gorbachev is kind of getting beat up by his child here, right? It's punching him in the face. He's got a black eye. And the caption of the cartoon is, "If she's like this as a baby, what will she be like when she's grown up?" So the artist here is clearly questioning what is going to be the long-term impact of a reform like glasnost. If you allow people in the Soviet Union more freedom of speech, if you allow them to criticize the government, what is going to happen in the long run? And I think the artist is really foreshadowing what was going to happen, which was that the Soviet Union was going to start to fall apart because they were, allowing more room for criticism, and there was lots to criticize. This is an American cartoon from 1987, which I love because of the art itself, and I also think it's a very funny cartoon. So here we have the Soviet Union pictured as a house, and you can see it's a little bit, it's very dilapidated. It's kind of falling apart. You get the idea that it's outdated, right? It has a straw roof. These machines in the background look very like old school. I mean, this looks like something like from the Industrial Revolution or something. It's belching all these clouds of black smoke. It's leaking some kind of waste, which I think is definitely the artist, making reference to the Chernobyl nuclear reaction explosion, which would have just happened the year before this cartoon was published. So it would have been fresh in people's minds. You've got the house surrounded by barbed wire. It's kind of cut off and isolated from everyone else. You don't see any other houses around it. In fact, the house is positioned on a cliff. So it doesn't seem like, the Soviet Union, according to this American artist, is a very great place to live. And here's Gorbachev, and he is here with his remodeling and renovation team. He's like a fixer-upper type guy. He's going to flip the house and sell it, right? So he's got his hammer and he's got his saw here, and he's saying a little paint, a patio, maybe a couple of skylights. This can be a dream house, right? With a few quick fixes, he's going to be able to turn the Soviet Union around and make it spectacular. And here are his two worker friends, and they say, "Psst, has Comrade Mike," they're calling him Comrade Mike because his first name is Mikhail, "has Comrade Mike been hitting the vodka?" Right? They're saying Gorbachev, are you drunk? How are you possibly imagining that a few quick fixes is what it's going to take to make this place livable? So the American cartoonist is obviously criticizing Gorbachev's method, saying that they don't go maybe far enough to make the Soviet Union a better place. And so that's another, I think, a contrasting view maybe to the previous cartoon. So before we go on to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, I'm going to pause and add that into a different video. So find that one next.